On April 26th, 1607, European settlers made landfall on what is now Cape Henry, off Chesapeake Bay on the east coast of what is now the United States. They sailed further inward over a few days and eventually built Jamestown Settlement. This is what would become the first permanent European settlement on what is now the lower 48 United States. The first few years of the Jamestown settlement were extremely brutal for the settlers. Within 3 years, more than half of them had died from starvation. Archaeological records indicate that the surviving settlers resorted to cannibalism in order to survive. That's how desperate the situation had gotten. Now, successful agriculture in the Jamestown settlement was a challenge for a number of reasons. First of all, most of these settlers did not come as experienced farmers. They were various kinds of tradesmen and lords who had arrived here under the charter, or had sailed here on behalf of the London Company of Virginia, chartered by King James, hence the Jamestown name. Among the many reasons that agriculture did not go well for the Jamestown settlers, despite very strenuous efforts, was first of all their lack of experience and deep knowledge of agriculture. Second, the agricultural products they had brought from Europe, the seeds, were seeds that were better suited to the climate of England, not the climate of what is now Virginia. Virginia is a much warmer climate. Different seeds grow better in different climates. But there was a method of farming called the three-field system, the three-field method. It's a sustainable method of agriculture. And it had been known in Europe for probably about 500 years, by half a millennium, by the time these settlers had arrived in the new land. 500 years, that's longer than when the three-field method was first introduced into Europe until up through the Jamestown settlement, than the time from the 1607 Jamestown settlement to today, when I'm recording this, almost exactly 418 years later. There was another method of sustainable agriculture known to the Native Americans with whom the European settlers had contact. It was the Three Sisters method. That's what we at least call the Three Sisters method. Now, I'm not an expert on this stuff, but I believe it's like corn, squash, and beans are planted together in the same field. And while each crop grows, they also replenish the soil at the same time. There's something about that combination that allows those crops to grow while also replenishing the soil. Adopting either of these methods would have allowed the Jamestown settlement to peacefully exist sustainably on the land that they claimed for themselves. But they didn't. And instead, after a time of great strife and starvation and death, and in fact, the Jamestown settlement was actually abandoned after a few years before the settlers returned to it. So it seemed like it was going to be another failed European settlement. It wasn't the first European settlement, but previous ones had failed, like the Roanoke settlement of about 20 years prior to this one. A critical thing that allowed the Jamestown settlement to sustain itself was that a strain of tobacco was introduced and grown in their land, in their soil, that was a very good strain of tobacco. I believe it was introduced by John Rolfe in 1612, so about 5 years. So 5 years after the settlement was established was when they started growing this really good strain of tobacco that became extremely profitable. It sold very well, made them a lot of money. It sold well in Europe. Now, the problem with growing tobacco is that it severely depletes the soil of nutrients. So once you grow tobacco, it's hard to grow anything else in there. The nutrients are severely depleted, especially nitrogen, and so eventually they couldn't grow tobacco on the same land. They'd grown sweet, profitable tobacco, but the land became desolate. So instead of establishing a sustainable, both as far as sustaining human life and also sustainable as in, it could be, you could exist that way perpetually, they instead opted for a cash crop that was, or a crop that was extremely profitable but would destroy the soil. It would destroy the environment so that they couldn't keep doing it. It was unsustainable. So that left the European settlers with a few options. One reason they didn't really care about the sustainability was because they looked around and they had an entire newly discovered landmass full of wealth and full of natural resources that they could go onto. So it didn't matter that they spoiled their land by growing tobacco on it instead of a sustainable agricultural method like the Three Fields method, which had been known in Europe for half a century or half a millennium, like 5 centuries, or the Three Sisters method that was known to Native American tribes with which they had made contact. Either of those methods could have allowed the Jamestown settlers to live sustainably, but they were unfortunately not profitable to the shareholders of the Virginia Company of London. And that is what mattered for the Jamestown settlers. They were indebted to the shareholders of the Virginia Company of London, and they had to keep producing profits for those people. But since they couldn't do it on the land that they had claimed because they had destroyed that land with the profitable crops that they had grown, they had to go seek other land. No problem. There's a whole huge landmass that they've just discovered, rich with resources. Well, one problem, right? There were already civilizations of humans living on those lands. So what do you do? Do you negotiate fairly with them, respecting that they are here first? Negotiate some kind of fair trade where everybody benefits? What's supposed to be the whole point of, this capitalist system we live under? It's mutually beneficial, free market, free exchange, buyer and seller both benefit. We get our bread not by the kindness of the bread maker, but by the bread maker's self-interest, and the bread maker gets his money not by appealing to our kindness, but by appealing to our self-interest. Do we try to appeal to the self-interest of the Native Americans, make a nice, fair Adam Smith trade? We know how that story goes. This is the story of the very first European settlers, the very first permanent European settlers in what's now the United States. A story of profit-seeking, of destruction of the environment, when sustainable alternatives existed. A story of destruction of other people when their existence was in the way of profit making. Profit before all else. Profit before sustainable environment. Profit before mutually beneficial exchange. Profit before human life and human freedom. That's the story of the very first European settlement in what is now the United States. 418 years later, we are still living that story. Only now it's not just that we have grown profitable tobacco and soil, but now destroyed the soil. It's the entire climate that sustains human life that we are destroying. We know we're doing it. We know it's unsustainable. We know alternatives exist, and instead of pursuing those alternatives, we continue destroying other people who are in the way of our profits, even when it means taking their land, even when it means impoverishing them, even when it means leaving them to die of disease. This is the story of pretty much all the third world, nearly all of Africa, nearly all of the Middle East, nearly all of South and Central America. And it's the story of plenty of people within the United States and Europe. Your life is in the way of making profits. Tough shit for you. Are you helping make profits? Are you helping the shareholder make profits? Okay. Then life might be okay for you. Until everything's destroyed. We have to come up with something else. We're living the same story 418 years later that played out for the first Europeans that came to what's now the United States. We need to be done with it. This needs to stop. We need to come up with something else. I don't know exactly what the something else is. I don't know exactly how we do it. I'll explore that at another time. But the story of our existence needs to be understood.